In the heart of a merciless desert, a father's past is catching up to him and his son's future is on the line. With a deadly treasure sought by every outlaw in the West and nowhere to hide, Mason has one chance to survive. Will he fight for the gold or the life he's trying to protect? The desert was vast, unyielding, and the heat? It was as though the sun had been set on a relentless course to burn everything to ash. A lone rider, Mason Rivers, cut through the swirling dust, his face carved into hard lines. Sweat clung to his brow, but his eyes were stone cold, staring ahead with a purpose. In the distance, the dust cloud wasn't from the wind. It was a group of riders, and Mason knew them. That dark silhouette on horseback wasn't just any lawman. It was Sheriff Carter Graves, the man who had destroyed his life. For years, Mason had trusted Graves, but Graves had betrayed him, killed his wife, stolen his future. Now the man with the badge was closing in, and Mason had a secret in his wagon, a secret that could bury Graves for good. A crackling, metallic voice broke the silence. "You've got a choice, Mason," the voice of Sheriff Graves called out from behind, his tone laced with a grim satisfaction. "Hand it over, and maybe we can both walk away. Refuse, and you'll regret the day you were ever born." But Mason knew something that Graves didn't. The truth was buried deep in the wreckage of his past, hidden in plain sight. Mason wasn't just running. He was heading straight for the endgame. The secret in his wagon could change everything. Mason's young son, Zane, sat at the front of the wagon, his eyes wide, his knuckles white on the reins. The boy's gaze darted to his father, trying to make sense of the unease that had settled over them like a storm. "Pa, what's wrong?" Zane asked, his voice shaking slightly. Mason said nothing at first, his mind racing. How could he explain to his son that their entire world was about to be shattered? That the very thing that had cost him his wife, Riley, was about to come for them both? Instead, he shifted his focus, noticing the small wooden horse in Zane's hands, an heirloom from Riley, a simple toy carved with care during the long cold winters. It had always seemed like just a toy. But now, as Mason's eyes lingered on it, a cold thought gripped his chest. Had Riley hidden it there? Did the toy hold more than just sentimental value? Had she been protecting something far more dangerous than a mere keepsake? The boy's soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Pa, the horse feels funny. It's cracked, is it?" Mason's heart lurched as his fingers brushed over the crack. It wasn't just wear and tear. It was something more. Something Riley had hidden. The map? He didn't have time to think. He needed to act fast. Everything was about to unravel. Before he could say another word, Zane gasped, his eyes wide in fear. The sound of hooves was growing louder, closer. The riders were almost upon them now. Carter Graves had found them. And with him, the lawmen who had once stood with Mason now turned enemies, chasing shadows for gold. Mason could feel the tension rise. The sand beneath his boots felt like it was pressing him into the earth, forcing him to make a choice. Run, fight, or give up everything for the secret, buried beneath layers of dust and history. But as the riders drew closer, Mason's mind was made up. They were here for the treasure, and the secret was in his son's hands. The wagon jerked too. A halt, and as the first rider dismounted, a cold sneer appeared on Carter Graves' face. "You think you can outrun me, Mason?" Graves drawled, stepping forward with that cocky arrogance Mason had once called brotherly. "I should have killed you when I had the chance." Mason's grip tightened around the reins, his heart pounding as he glanced back at Zane, who was holding onto the wooden horse, clutching it like it was his last piece of safety in a world gone. Mad, Graves did not know what was coming. ***, no one did. But Mason was about to make sure they never got their hands on the map, no matter the cost. "Hand it over," Mason Graves said, his gun drawn. "And this can be over. Your boy, your life it." is all salvageable. But that toy, the Bible, the treasure they were meant for, it is mine now. Mason felt the weight of his son's life in his chest. The map wasn't just a map, it was the key to destroying Graves and everything he stood for. It had cost Riley her life. It could cost them everything. Mason's heart thundered as he made a decision. Run, Zane, he shouted, shoving his son toward the rocks. Go! As Zane scrambled to obey, the toy slipped from his hands, tumbling to the ground. The wooden horse cracked open like a treasure chest, spilling papers, a map that could make or break their future. The desert air was alive with tension. And then, in a blink, everything exploded. Mason rushed toward the papers, but Graves was faster. He dove for the map, his hand reaching for it with greed-fueled desperation. But Mason tackled him first. Graves' men were closing in now, guns drawn, their intent clear. They were going to kill Mason, take the map, and erase every trace of the truth. A gunshot rang out. The wind howled through the canyon walls, whipping the desert dust into a frenzy. Mason held his ground, the weight of the map now burning in his hand like a cursed treasure. The morning sun beat down, unforgiving and cruel, but the shadow of what was about to happen hung heavier. Graves was on the ground, pinned beneath Mason's weight. His face twisted in fury, but there was something else to fear. Fear of what Mason knew and what Mason would do with it. Get off me! Graves spat, trying to shove Mason aside, but the man's strength was too much. The fight wasn't just physical anymore, it was personal. Mason's knuckles cracked as they clenched around the map, knowing this was it. There was no turning back. The silence of the desert was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Mason's heart skipped. The cavalry was coming. But it was not just a handful of riders. It was a full patrol, and they weren't here for any friendly reason. Move, Mason. Graves snarled, finally shoving him off and scrambling to his feet. He wasn't the man Mason used to know. He wasn't even the man he had once respected. He was a snake, a traitor who had let his greed destroy everything. You think I will just walk away? Mason grunted, scrambling to his feet. He'd been to hell and back for less. You have crossed too many lines. The sound of Graves' men yelling to each other grew louder. The standoff was reaching its breaking point. Mason could see them now, drawn guns, hungry eyes. But there was something else, something far worse. A man wasn't just coming for the gold. He was coming for Mason's life. Zane had hidden behind the rocks, eyes wide with terror, watching his father fight for his life. He'd never seen Mason like this, so determined, so fierce. The young boy's hands gripped the wooden horse tighter, his tiny body trembling with fear. He did not fully understand the weight of what was happening, but he knew that the moment he'd seen that look in his father's eyes, nothing would ever be the same. A shout from one of the riders brought him back to the present. That boy, he got the map, one of the men screamed. Mason's heart lurched as he saw Graves' men shift focus. Zane, his son, was the new target, and the map in his hands would change everything. Zane, no! Mason yelled, his voice crackling with desperation. Without thinking, he charged toward his son, pushing past the chaos of men and bullets. He had to get to him. The map was never meant for these animals. It was never meant to destroy the last of his family. But before Mason could reach him, one of Graves' men, a grizzled rider named Davis, spurred his horse forward, a dark grin spreading across his face. I will take the boy, Mason, he sneered. He is just a pawn. But the map, the treasure, now that belongs to us. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Mason's body screamed in pain from the exertion, but his heart was steady calm. He was about to make the biggest choice of his life. The boy's safety was more important than any gold, than any treasure, than anything Graves could throw at him. But when he reached his son, his heart shattered. Zane was still clutching the horse, The map pieces of the treasure's location was just beyond his small fingers. Zane's innocent face looked up at his father, and all Mason could see was the future. The future he would sacrifice everything to protect. Mason yanked Zane behind him, his hand gripping his son's arm tightly, his other arm still holding the map. For a moment, it seemed like the world stopped. Then the bullets began to fly. Graves' men surrounded them. But Mason had one thing. They didn't. Determination. Get them. Graves roared, his voice filled with rage. Kill them. The first gunshot cracked the air like thunder. Mason was on instinct now, his body moving with the precision of a man who had been forced to fight for his survival. He dove behind a rock outcropping with his son and returned fire, his aim steady, his heart focused on only one thing: protecting Zane. The riders were coming closer. Mason couldn't keep this up for long. But then, through the gunfire, there was a sound that made his blood run cold. More riders, more enemies. The cavalry had arrived, but they weren't here to help him. Hold your fire. A gruff voice bellowed. From behind Mason, he turned, only to find a dozen soldiers from the nearby fort. But there was one man leading them. A sergeant named Liam Griggs, a man who owed Mason a favor from years ago. Griggs? What the hell are you doing here? Mason demanded, his gun still raised. You think Graves doesn't have enemies of his own? Griggs sneered, his hand going up to silence Mason's questions. I've been tracking him for months. It's time someone took that bastard down. The chaos intensified as Griggs' men moved in to secure the area, guns drawn. But Mason's mind was still spinning. He'd been running from this moment for far too long. Graves, Griggs said, taking a step toward the sheriff, his voice low and menacing. Your time is up. In that moment, everything fell into place. Graves looked around, his face hard with defiance. You've been playing both sides, Griggs. You think these men will stand with you? I don't need men who are loyal to a liar and murderer. Griggs snapped, his voice full of contempt. You had your chance. Zane tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice shaky. Pa, what's happening? Why are they all fighting? Mason looked at his son, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself a breath of relief. Zane was safe for now. But the fight wasn't over. You don't understand, son, Mason said quietly, ruffling his hair. This battle is about much more than just gold. It's about who gets to write our story. It's about the truth and who decides to control it. The cavalry was almost finished with the cleanup, but Graves was still on his feet. He wasn't going down without a fight. And Mason wasn't going to let his son be a casualty of this war for power and greed. As the last shot rang out and the dust settled, Mason had a choice to make. He could take the treasure, risk everything for a chance, a fortune, or he could let it burn. The sun began to sink low, casting long shadows across the desert. Mason stood at the edge of the camp, holding his son close, the map now just a piece of history in his pocket. The soldiers had cleared the area, and Graves and his men were either dead or captured. But Mason knew something deeper, something more profound. The treasure wasn't worth his soul. Zane tugged at his father's sleeve again. Pa, do you think we'll ever be safe? Mason's eyes softened as he knelt down to look at his son. The road had been long. It had been hard. But this was his legacy. Not the gold, not the map. It was his family. We're safe now, son, Mason said, the weight of his words settling in. We're safe. The fire crackled softly, its embers casting fleeting shadows across the desert night. Mason sat beside Zane, his arms around the boy, keeping him close. The cavalry had taken the prisoners, Graves and his men, back to the fort, but Mason knew that the battle was far from over. There was one question that had yet to be answered, one piece of the puzzle that still haunted him. Why had they wanted the map so badly? The gold was buried deep in the earth. Too deep, too hard to find. The legends told of its location being hidden away for a reason, and that reason was tied to the blood of those who'd gone after it. The map may have been destroyed, but Mason knew that the secrets of Samuel Harrison's treasure didn't die with the last scrap of paper. They lived on, in whispers and legends. And they weren't finished with him yet. "You think we're really safe, Pa?" Zane's voice was small, full of uncertainty. Mason had heard it before, the same fear every child had when they'd seen the darkness up close. Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked into the distance, where the faint outlines of the soldiers' wagons disappeared behind the rising dust. The air was still, dead quiet, but something was off. "Stay close to me, son," Mason said, his voice steady, but his eyes alert. "We're not out of danger yet." Zane didn't argue. He never did when it came to his father. He trusted Mason more than anyone else in this world. More than Mason trusted himself. Just as Mason was about to stoke the fire, there came a sound that froze the blood in his veins. The unmistakable creak of hooves on dry earth. Mason's hand instinctively dropped to the revolver holstered at his side. He could hear voices, low and urgent, drifting on the wind. Not soldiers, outlaws. The sudden realization hit him like a slap in the face. They hadn't killed everyone. Graves wasn't the only one who wanted what Samuel Harrison had hidden. Away, there were more. More men who had been waiting in the shadows. Mason's eyes locked onto the horizon. Figures in the distance. At least 6 riders. But this wasn't a random encounter. No, this was a new threat. And it was closing in fast. "Zane," Mason whispered, his voice a low hiss. "Get behind the rocks and don't make a sound. Not until I say so." Zane's face paled, but he didn't hesitate. He trusted his father completely, and he knew what that look in Mason's eyes meant. Danger. Mason stood, positioning himself between his son and the approaching riders, his heart pounding in his chest. The fire crackled behind him, but it didn't give the comfort it should have. Instead, the flames flickered like the last remnants of a dying hope. Mason didn't have long to wait. Within minutes, the riders were upon him. 6 men, dressed in ragged clothes, their faces hardened by years of desert life. The leader, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his face, was the first to speak. "You Mason rider?" The scarred man growled, his voice like gravel being ground beneath boots. Mason didn't flinch. "Who's asking?" The scarred man grinned, showing crooked, yellow teeth. "We heard about what happened back at the fort. Graves didn't take what he should have, and now we're here for the rest. You've got something that belongs to us." Mason's pulse quickened. These men were after more than just the treasure. They were after his life. "You're looking for a ghost," Mason replied, his voice hard, refusing to give them the satisfaction of fear. "The map's gone." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "The map, yes, but the gold. That's still waiting to be found. And we're not leaving without it." Mason took a slow step forward, his hand steady, but the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "You won't find it. The map's gone. You've wasted your time coming here." One of the riders, a younger man with a nervous twitch in his eyes, spurred his horse forward. "We've been following you, Mason. We know what you're hiding. The gold isn't just a fairy tale. We'll find it." Mason's heart skipped. They knew. But how? "Are you really this stupid?" Mason growled, keeping his eyes locked on the scarred man. "Do you think you can scare me into handing over what's long gone? No. There's nothing left for you." The scarred man's grin widened, and it was the last thing Mason saw before he heard the command. "Shoot him." The desert erupted. In a blaze of gunfire, Mason dropped to the ground instinctively, the hot wind of the bullets whizzing past him. He rolled behind a boulder, his breath shallow and quick. They weren't playing games anymore. He wasn't just a man with a map. He was the key to a lost treasure. And now every outlaw in the desert wanted a piece of him. His revolver was all ready. In his hand, no hesitation. He returned fire, the sharp reports echoing across the desert as his bullets found their mark. The riders scattered, but Mason knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Behind him, he heard Zane's soft voice. "Pa, please. Don't fight them, please. Let's go." Mason gritted his teeth. The boy was terrified, but he didn't have a choice. He couldn't run. Not now. Not when the fight was already here. "Get down." Mason shouted, turning and pulling Zane into the dirt behind another rock outcropping. A bullet struck the ground just inches from where they were hiding. The riders were closing in. Mason's mind raced. The map was gone. The treasure was no longer the focus. This was about something else. Now survival. Mason's hands shook as he loaded the last of his bullets into his revolver. But even as he prepared for what was to come, something in the back of his mind screamed that this fight was part of a much larger game. The scarred man and his men were trying to force his hand, to make him play a part in this tragedy, but Mason wasn't about to fall for it. He had only one choice now. Mason rose from behind the rock, his movements quick, fluid, like a man who'd seen too many fights and wasn't afraid of dying. "Let's finish this," he muttered, stepping into the open. But just as Mason was about to pull the trigger, a loud whistle rang out. The sound echoed through the canyon, sharp and unmistakable. Mason froze. From the corner of his eye, he saw a flash of something, a rider in black, a stranger with a devil-may-care grin, riding fast and straight into the fray. In a blur of motion, the mysterious rider fired once, twice, knocking the guns from the hands of two of Graves' men. The scarred leader cursed, "Who the hell?" And before he could finish, the rider was on him, knocking him to the ground. With one well-placed strike, the remaining outlaws hesitated, unsure of what to do. Mason was stunned. Who was this man? And what the hell did he want? "You've made a hell of a mess, Mason," the rider said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of danger. "But I think you'll be glad I showed up." The rider, dressed in black from head to toe, gave a brief nod to Mason, his face still hidden in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. There was something about him, something unsettling. His movements were precise, calculated, like a man who had seen too many battles and wasn't afraid to wade through the blood. Mason wasn't sure if this was help or a new set of problems, but for now, he would take the man's interference over being riddled with bullets. "Get them out of here, rider," the rider said, his voice low but commanding. "I'll handle the rest." Mason's hand tightened around his revolver, but the rider's presence disarmed him, literally and figuratively. He hadn't seen anyone move like that before. "Who the hell are you?" Mason demanded, his voice low and wary. His hand hovered near Zane, ready to pull him away if things went south. The rider chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "I think you'll find that question answered soon enough." The scarred man and the remaining riders were regrouping, some of them still nursing their wounds. They hadn't expected this twist, and now they seemed uncertain. A few looked to the rider, then to Mason, their fingers twitching near their holsters. "You'll regret this," one of the outlaws muttered, his voice laced with venom. The rider didn't even look at him. He simply shifted his weight and placed his hand on the handle of his pistol. "Make your move or get out of here, your choice." The tension was thick in the air, but the outlaws, seeing no easy way out, began to back off, muttering threats under their breath. They might have been ruthless, but they weren't stupid. It was clear they were outmatched for now. Mason watched the last of them retreat, his hand still resting on his gun, ready to draw if necessary. Once the riders were out of sight, the mysterious man turned to Mason and Zane. "You need to get moving," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They'll be back, and in greater numbers." Mason frowned. "Who are you?" The rider didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out over the desert, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. "I'm just a man looking for something. Similar to what you're looking for," he finally said, his voice laced with an air of mystery. "But I'm not the one you need to worry about. The real danger's still out there." Before Mason could question him further, the rider turned his horse around and gave him a brief nod. "Get to the mountains. You're not safe here." Mason hesitated, but only for a moment. This stranger had just saved their lives, and there was no time for second guessing. Zane tugged at Mason's sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "Pa, who was that? What does he want?" Mason glanced down at his son, his jaw set tight. "I don't know, Zane, but we're not sticking around to find out." With no other options, Mason gathered his son and made for the nearby ridge, climbing the steep slope that would lead them toward the safety of the mountains. The rider's warning echoed in his mind. The real danger was out there. They had to keep moving. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The mountains loomed ahead, an intimidating silhouette in the moonlight. They offered shelter, yes, but also the unknown. Mason knew the desert better than most, but the mountains held secrets even he couldn't predict. Zane was quiet now, though Mason could feel the weight of his gaze, always searching for some semblance of reassurance from his father. But Mason had none to give. There was no easy answer to what they were up against. Graves was gone, but the quest for Harrison's treasure was far from over. Mason's mind raced as they walked, step by careful step. Why had the map been so important? What were they missing? There was a cold truth in the pit of Mason's stomach. Someone else was after more than just the gold. The man in black had been right. There was something darker at play. Whoever wanted the treasure was willing to spill blood for it, and that blood wasn't done flowing. They reached a small cave just as the first signs of dawn lit the desert, the shadows giving way to an unforgiving light. Mason settled down inside the cave, his back against the cool stone. Zane curled up next to him, exhausted but still alert, his eyes scanning the distance. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted not just by outlaws, but by something older, something tied to the land itself. The treasure wasn't the only thing people were after. He didn't speak for a long time, but Zane eventually broke the silence. "Pa, why are we going after this gold?" Mason sighed, the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. He looked at his son, his eyes hard with the burden of his own choices. "We're not after gold, Zane," he said quietly. "We're after answers." But the truth was, Mason wasn't even sure who he was trying to find them for anymore. The fire had been ignited long ago. The search for Samuel Harrison's treasure had already set them on a path. Now there was no turning back. And the real question was whether Mason and Zane would make it out alive, or if they'd be swallowed whole by the desert, as so many others before them. By the time the sun had fully risen, the day had turned uncomfortably hot. The air shimmered like heat off the ground, and the wind carried the faintest whisper of dust. But Mason didn't dare stay in one place too long. They were vulnerable here. "I think we should head for the old mine," Mason said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It's the best chance we've got to stay hidden, and it might have something useful. At least it's something." Zane looked at him, hesitant but trusting. "But what about the men who are after us, Pa? They won't stop. We keep moving, stay ahead. We have to be smarter than them." Mason's thoughts turned inward as they packed up their things. He'd made a lot of mistakes in his life, but he wasn't about to make another one. He wasn't going to let the same ghosts that had haunted his past claim his son. "Get ready, Zane," he said softly. "We're about to step into the fire." As they ventured toward the mine, Mason kept his senses sharp. The world felt too quiet, too still. It was like the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And as the rocks gave way to jagged cliffs in the distance, Mason couldn't help but wonder, what had he really gotten them into? The sun beat down as Mason and Zane made their way toward the abandoned mine. The trek had been slow, deliberate, and every step forward felt like walking deeper into a web. Mason could feel it, the tightening noose of fate closing around them. The desert had a way of trapping people, and he had always been good at surviving. But even he couldn't ignore the creeping sense that this time, survival might not be enough. They reached the mine's entrance by mid-afternoon. The iron door, half sunk into the earth, was weathered and rusted, its hinges squealing in protest when Mason shoved it open. Dust kicked up around them as the door creaked, revealing a dark, foreboding tunnel that stretched into the mountain's belly. "Stay close," Mason instructed Zane, his voice low and cautious. The last thing he wanted was to be ambushed in the dark. Zane nodded, but Mason could see the unease in his son's eyes. The boy was trying to be brave, but it was hard not to feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. They'd seen enough horror to last a lifetime, but the sense that something far worse was closing in was unmistakable. The air inside. The mine was thick with the smell of old earth and stagnant air. Mason's footsteps echoed off the walls as they moved deeper into the tunnel. Their shadows stretched long in the flickering light of Mason's lantern, creeping along the uneven stone floor like ghosts themselves. "This place is ancient," Mason muttered. "They used to dig for silver here years ago, but it was abandoned long before I was born." Zane looked up at him, his voice small. "Do you think the treasure is here, Pa?" Mason hesitated, his hand tightening on the lantern handle. "I don't know. But if we're going to find anything, answers, the gold, or even some way out of this mess, we have to keep going." Zane didn't argue. He trusted his father's judgment more than anything. But even trust couldn't make the dark corners of the mine any less oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around them as they walked, and with every step, Mason felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him. Every path he'd chosen had led him to this moment, and the deeper they went, the more Mason began to wonder if he had led his son into a trap. Suddenly, a low scraping sound, echoed through the mine. Mason's instincts flared. His hand shot to his revolver, pulling it free from its holster. "Pa," Zane whispered, his voice laced with fear. Mason held up a hand, signaling for him to stay quiet. He crouched low, the silence stretching between them, thick as tar. Then, it came again, the scraping sound. And then a new noise, footsteps. Not just one set, but two, maybe three. They were coming closer. Mason's heart pounded. He couldn't make out who or what it was, but there was no mistaking the intent in the sound. Someone was in the mine with them. "Mason," a voice called. Out softly from the shadows. It was a voice Mason knew. It was the voice of the man in black. Mason didn't lower his gun. Instead, he scanned the shadows for any movement. The man in black had saved them before, but Mason wasn't about to drop his guard now. He had no idea who this man really was or what he wanted. "Still looking for answers, I see." The man's voice echoed off the walls, a hint of amusement behind it. Mason's grip on the revolver tightened, his jaw clenching. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I told you I had my own reasons for being in this game," the man said, his voice still smooth but carrying an edge of coldness. "And you've managed to get yourself in deeper than you know." Mason's eyes narrowed. "I don't need your help, stranger. I've had enough of people saving me for their own agendas." The man in black chuckled softly, stepping into the light of Mason's lantern. The shadows hid most of his features, but his devil-may-care grin was unmistakable. He was tall, built like a man who had seen far too many gunfights and lived to tell the tale. "Like I said before, Mason, you're in this whether you like it or not. And this," he gestured around the mine, "this is just the beginning. You think they were the only ones after the treasure? You're about to find out how wrong you are." Before Mason could respond, the man in black stepped forward, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a small, weathered map that looked very much like the one that had been destroyed in the firefight. Mason's breath caught in his throat. How the hell did he get that? The man in black tossed the map onto the ground in front of Mason, his smile never fading. "You were always chasing ghosts, Ryder," the man said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "But there's no escaping what's buried out here." Mason knelt down, his eyes scanning the map. It wasn't the same map that had been destroyed, but it showed similar markings, similar paths, routes, and symbols that had haunted him for weeks. It was a blueprint, a guide to the treasure, and its location had been changed, moved. "You've been following the wrong trail," the man continued, watching Mason's face. "You're on the right path now, but you're not the only one who's figured it out." Mason looked up, his eyes locked on the man's face. "What do you want from me?" "I want what's mine," the man said simply, his gaze unwavering. "And you're going to help me get it." Mason stood slowly, his eyes darting to the shadows once more. He didn't trust this man, but he couldn't deny the truth in his words. There was something bigger at play here, something Mason had only begun to scratch the surface of. "We can either work together, or we can keep trying to kill each other. But if we're going to find the treasure and make it out of here alive, you need to decide right now which side you're on." Mason's mind raced. What the hell was going on? Who was this man really? But before he could think any further, the sound of footsteps interrupted him again. Only this time, there was no mistaking the danger. Mason didn't even have time to react before a dozen armed men emerged from the shadows of the mine. They were well armed, wearing dark, tactical clothing, mercenaries. The man in black didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge them as they surrounded Mason and Zane. Instead, he looked directly at Mason and said, "Meet the ones who've been following you. They've been hunting the treasure for a lot longer than you." Mason's heart sank. He had walked into a trap, and now there was no way out. One of the mercenaries, a man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Mason Ryder," he said, his voice cold. "You've got something we want. Hand it over." Mason reached for his gun, but before he could pull it free, the mercenaries' men closed in, their rifles aimed squarely at him. The man in black didn't move a muscle, as though this was all part of the plan. "Looks like the tables have turned, Ryder," he said, his grin widening. "This is where your story ends, but don't worry. It's only just beginning for me." The mercenaries closed in, their weapons trained on Mason. Zane was still behind him, crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. Mason could feel his pulse hammering in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had faced worse than this. He had to keep his focus. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The man in black hadn't moved, his hands casually tucked into his coat pockets, watching the standoff with cold amusement. The mercenary with the scar stepped closer, his rifle barrel glinting in the dim light. "We don't want to make this messy, Ryder," the scarred man said, his voice low and threatening. "Just hand it over. The treasure's as good as ours now." Mason's fingers tightened around the grip of his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. He kept his eyes locked on the scarred man, every muscle in his body tense. "You think this is gonna be easy?" Mason asked, his voice steady, even as his heart raced. "You think I'm just gonna hand over what you've been hunting for all this time?" The mercenary's lips curled into a sneer. "That's what you're going to do, whether you like it or not." Mason took a deep breath, his gaze flicking to the map on the ground, then to the man in black. He could feel it now. The man in black wasn't just playing a game. He was orchestrating it. "Let me make this simple," Mason said, his tone calm, too calm for the situation. "If you think you've got me cornered, you're wrong. I'm not the one who's trapped." A cold laugh escaped the scarred man's lips. "You're not the one calling the shots here, Ryder." But just as he raised his rifle to make his demand, a sharp noise rang out from the far side of the mine. The sound of something heavy scraping along the rock. The mercenaries jerked their heads toward the sound, momentarily distracted. Mason didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, he reached for his revolver, pulled it free, and fired twice in quick succession. The first shot hit the mercenary closest to him in the shoulder. The second struck the scarred man in the leg, sending him crashing to the ground with a howl of pain. The rest of the mercenaries scrambled, diving for cover as bullets ricocheted off the rock walls. Mason moved fast, ducking behind a boulder as the remaining men opened fire. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He'd been in worse spots before. He wasn't going to let it end here. Behind him, Zane's voice broke through the chaos. "Pa, what do we do?" Mason gritted his teeth. "Stay down." "Don't move unless I say so." The boy's voice trembled. "What about you? I'll handle this, just trust me." The mine exploded with the sound of gunfire. Mason's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of escape, but there was none. He was boxed in, outnumbered. His only choice now was to fight his way out. Mason kept low, his mind working in overdrive. He needed a plan, and fast. The mercenaries were good. Too good, but they weren't invincible. He took a breath, his eyes scanning the layout of the mine. The tunnel ahead was narrow, the walls jagged. If he could make it to the opening just beyond the next bend, he might be able to outmaneuver them. Mason turned to Zane, who was pressed flat against the rock, his eyes wide with fear. The boy's hands were clenched tight, but Mason could see the anxiety written all over his face. Mason had to get them both out of this. "Zane," Mason whispered urgently. "We're gonna move fast, okay? I need you to stay close and stay quiet. Don't make a sound unless I say." Zane nodded, his face pale, but there was a glimmer of trust in his eyes. He would follow Mason's lead. He always did. Mason took one last glance at the mercenaries, still scrambling for position. The man in black had disappeared into the shadows, his whereabouts unknown. But for now, Mason couldn't worry about him. He needed to focus on getting out alive. "Now," Mason hissed. They moved in a crouch, their steps swift and silent. The mercenaries hadn't noticed their movement yet. Mason and Zane pressed against the rough walls of the mine, staying low as they edged closer to the narrow tunnel ahead. Just as they reached the bend, a shout rang out, "Look out!" Mason turned instinctively, drawing his revolver and firing once, twice. The nearest mercenary crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering out of reach. "Go!" Mason shouted, urging Zane forward. They sprinted toward the tunnel opening, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. Zane's breath was ragged, his feet stumbling as they pushed through the tight passage. The walls scraped against their clothes, but Mason kept them moving. They couldn't stop, not now. Ahead of them, the light grew brighter. Their escape was almost in sight. But then, just as they reached the entrance, the man in black stepped into their path. Mason froze, his revolver aimed straight at the stranger. "Not so fast," the man said, his voice calm as ever. "You think you're getting out of here so easily?" The mercenaries were closing in fast, their guns raised, ready to fire. Mason's eyes darted between the man in black and the approaching threat. "I thought you were on our side," Mason said, his voice full of disbelief. The man in black smiled, a sharp glint in his eyes. "Did you really think I was here to help you, Mason? I told you, I'm in this for my own reasons. You were just a convenient distraction." Mason's heart sank. He'd been played. The mercenaries were closing in now, surrounding them. Mason's options were running out. But even as the odds stacked against him, one thought kept running through his mind. There was no way he was going down without a fight. He took one last breath, his hand steady on the grip of his revolver. "Then let's make this a real fight." The air was thick with tension as Mason stared down the man in black. Behind him, Zane was frozen, fear etched into his young face. The mercenaries were closing in, their guns aimed with lethal precision. The entrance to the mine was blocked. The odds had never been worse. Mason's heart beat loud in his ears, but his grip on the revolver didn't waver. He had no choice but to fight, even if he was outgunned and surrounded. He wasn't about to let them take his son. Not without a hell of a fight. "You think you can walk away from this?" Mason growled, his eyes locked on the man in black. "You're just as dead as the rest of them." The stranger didn't flinch. He stood tall, the flickering light from the torches reflecting off his cold eyes. "I don't plan to die today, Mason. But you'll have to make a choice." Mason's pulse quickened. A choice? What was this bastard talking about? Before he could respond, one of the mercenaries shouted, "It's over, Ryder. Drop the gun, and nobody else has to die." Mason's mind raced. There was no way out. No way to escape without bloodshed. He could see the desperation in the mercenaries' eyes, the greed and the fear. But the most dangerous ones were the ones that feared nothing. And these mercenaries feared one thing above all, the treasure. "You're all fools," Mason spat, his eyes flashing. "The treasure you want, it's not even worth dying for." The man in black smiled, his lips curling into a predator's grin. "That's where you're wrong. It's worth more than you can imagine. And we all know it's not just about the gold anymore, Mason. This is personal." Mason's gut clenched. He was right. It wasn't just about the treasure. It was about power. About something much darker than gold. And the ghosts of the past were about to rise up again. Boom. A deafening explosion rocked the mine. The ground beneath them trembled, and the mercenaries staggered, disoriented. The man in black's eyes widened for just a second, a distraction. Mason didn't hesitate. In that split second, he sprinted toward the nearest mercenary, his revolver blazing. A shot rang out, hitting the man square in the chest, and he dropped without a sound. But the mercenaries weren't done, not by a long shot. Mason heard Zane's voice from behind him, sharp and panicked. "Pa! Look out!" Mason spun just in time to see the shadow of a rifle barrel aimed at him. Without thinking, he dove to the ground, just as a bullet grazed his side. Pain shot through his body, but he ignored it. He had to move. He had to protect Zane. "Stay down." Mason shouted as he pulled Zane behind the cover of a jagged rock formation. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't question. His father's command, not this time. The man in black was still standing at the entrance of the mine, his arms folded, watching the chaos unfold. The mercenaries had regrouped, now attacking with renewed fury. Mason's bullets were running low, and the gold, that damn gold, was still out there, buried deep in the desert, hidden away for good reason. But none of it mattered now, not with Zane in danger. It was time to end this. Mason's eyes flicked to the far side of the mine, where the explosion had caused part of the ceiling to cave in. Dust and debris filled the air, choking everything in sight. The stench of sulfur and burning timber mixed with the metallic tang of blood. The mine had become a tomb, and every minute they stayed was 1 minute closer to being buried alive. There was a narrow passageway just beyond the rubble. It was their only chance. They had to move fast, and Mason had to keep Zane safe. If they didn't, they would both be buried in this hellhole, trapped by greed, violence, and the legacy of a history that had never let them go. "Zane, stay with me. We're getting out of here," Mason said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. His son's wide eyes stared back at him, full of fear, but also something more. Trust. Trust that Mason would do anything to get them both out of this alive. Zane nodded, his breath ragged as he followed Mason through the dust and debris. His small form clung to Mason's side, almost desperate for the protection his father had always promised, but never fully delivered. The collapse of the mine behind them was a reminder of all that had been lost, and what would be lost if they didn't make it out. But this time, Mason wasn't going to fail him. He couldn't afford to. Each step felt heavier than the last. The mine was falling apart. the walls groaning under the weight of the explosion. The air was thick with dust, making it almost impossible to see, and every creaking sound overhead sent a jolt of panic through Mason's gut. He knew the odds were against them, but the way out was just ahead. But as they neared the tunnel's entrance, a familiar figure stepped forward again, like a shadow materializing from the smoke. The man in black. "Going somewhere, Ryder?" He sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You're not leaving this mine alive." Mason's pulse quickened, his hand instinctively going to the revolver holstered at his side. The man's figure blocked their only escape, a dark, deadly silhouette that had followed them through every twist and turn of this nightmare. He had seen this man too many times before, heard that voice, felt the weight of those eyes. The man in black was no ordinary enemy. He was a symbol of everything Mason had fought to escape. Everything that had dragged him back into this desert. Everything that had torn his life apart. And now it had all come down to this. "I've had enough of you," Mason growled, his voice low, guttural. He didn't care what it took. He wasn't going to let this man stop him. He would get Zane out of here. The man in black wasn't going to dictate his fate any longer. But just as Mason reached for his revolver, a piercing scream rang out, an agonizing, desperate shriek that split the air. The mercenaries had been caught off guard again. Another wave of gunfire erupted, a flurry of chaos that ricocheted off the walls, further muddling the confusion. Mason froze. What was going on now? A fresh figure appeared from the shadows, just like the man in black, a rider draped in the same ominous attire. Armed with a rifle, the man was ready to fire, his cold eyes gleaming through the dust. Mason's thoughts raced. More reinforcements? But before Mason could react, the man in black's face twisted into an ugly snarl. No, this wasn't part of the plan. The sudden shift of focus, the chaos, gave Mason the window he needed. Without thinking, he fired. The revolver roared in his hand. The bullet struck true, hitting the man in black square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground with a violent grunt, his grip on his rifle faltering before he collapsed lifeless. But Mason didn't have time to savor the moment of victory. The battle wasn't over. Mason grabbed Zane by the arm, pulling him into the tunnel. His son didn't resist, but Mason could feel the weight of his fear and the tightness of his grip. Zane was struggling to keep up. His legs, too small, too weak to match Mason's pace, were starting to fail him. His breath came in short, painful bursts, but Mason couldn't slow down. He had no choice. The mine continued to collapse behind them, the ceiling above groaning like it was about to cave in completely. Pieces of rock and debris fell like rain, swallowing the sounds of battle. The mercenaries, the man in black, they were fading away, victims of their own greed, consumed by the very darkness they had sought to control. But there was still more to come. Mason's heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't dare slow down. They had no time to waste, not now. "Stay close, Zane," he said, pushing his son forward. His voice was strained, but it carried a weight of determination. They ducked beneath a fallen beam, the dust choking them both as they kept moving. The tunnel twisted and turned like a labyrinth, and the air grew colder and thicker with each passing second. The deeper they went, the harder it became to breathe. Sweat stung Mason's eyes, and his muscles ached with fatigue, but he forced his legs to keep moving. There was no other option. "We have to get to the surface," he said again, the words feeling like a mantra, a promise he would keep. "We can't stop now, not yet." But just as they neared the exit, a familiar voice echoed through the tunnel, a voice that Mason knew all too well. "You're not done yet, Ryder." Mason's breath hitched in his throat. The man in black, he wasn't dead. Somehow he had survived, and now he was coming after them again. Mason turned to Zane, his face tight with urgency. "Don't stop, son. Keep moving." They had reached the surface. The moonlit desert stretched out before them like a vast, empty void. The exit was within reach. But Mason knew deep in his bones that they weren't safe yet. Not until they were far away from this nightmare. He gripped Zane's shoulder, his fingers digging into the boy's skin as he pulled him closer, protecting him from whatever might be lurking in the shadows. The boy's skin was cold to the touch. Listen to me. When we get out there, stay behind me. No matter what happens, don't move until I say so. Zane nodded, his small face pale but resolute. The boy had seen enough of the world to understand the danger, to know that this was the final stretch. And sure enough, as soon as the words left Mason's lips, the man in black appeared, his silhouette cutting through the desert night like a blade. He was unscathed, his eyes burning with malice, the rifle in his hand ready to take them down. You think you've won, Ryder? The man's voice was a sneer, his words laced with fury. You're nothing but a pawn in this game. And pawns never get the gold. Mason's fingers twitched on his revolver. He could feel the weight of the gun in his hand. His instincts screamed at him to draw, but something deeper held him back. No, Mason said quietly, his voice firm, unwavering. You're wrong. I didn't fight for gold. I fought for him. The man in black's lips curled into a twisted smirk. You think that boy's gonna save you? You think the treasure's gonna make you a hero? You're nothing but a relic of the past. Mason's anger surged hot and blinding. But more than that, he felt the weight of everything that had brought him here. All the years of searching, the losses, the sacrifices. He had fought against a life that had already taken everything from him. He had bled for the gold, for the promise of something more. But now, standing here, he realized that he didn't need to fight anymore. The past had claimed too much already. No, Mason whispered, his voice steady with cold resolve. It ends now. In one fluid motion, Mason lunged forward, the desert air still and heavy as he raised his revolver. The man in black fired first, the shot tearing through the air, but Mason's reflexes were sharper. The bullet whizzed past his shoulder. He ignored the sting as the bullet grazed his skin. His aim was true. His revolver roared, and the man in black staggered back, a look of shock and disbelief crossing his face as he fell to his knees, blood soaking through his shirt. Mason didn't hesitate. He walked toward him slowly, purposefully, the crunch of his boots loud in the otherwise silent desert. You made one mistake, Mason said, his voice cold as steel. You thought you could take everything from me. But you never understood one thing. The man in black coughed, blood trickling from his mouth as he struggled to breathe. His eyes were filled with hatred, but there was something else there too, fear. What's that? He rasped, barely able to make the words. Mason's eyes hardened. He knew what had to be done. He had made his choice long before this moment, and now it was time to end it. I'm not the one who needs saving. With that, Mason turned his back on the man in black, walking toward Zane. Behind him, the man in black struggled, but Mason knew there would be no more threats, no more battles. The fight was over. The dawn was beginning to break, casting a soft light over the desert as Mason and Zane walked away from the mine. Quiet after the storm was almost deafening, the air still and thick with the weight of everything that had happened. Zane's hand gripped Mason's tighter than before. The boy was silent now, but Mason could see it in his eyes. The fear was still there, but it was fading. They had survived. You okay, son? Mason asked softly, glancing down at his son, whose face had softened from the hardness of fear to something else. I'm okay, Pa, Zane replied quietly. They reached the entrance of the mine, the place where it all began. The gold was there, piled high and gleaming in the dim light. But there was more. Something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Mason moved carefully through the darkened mine, his breath slow and deliberate. The walls closing in with every step. The gold shone in the faint light that flickered from the torch he held, the metal gleaming like a siren's call promising power, freedom, and wealth. But as he moved deeper into the chamber, something tugged at him, a sense that there was more than just the treasure here. He paused, squinting into the shadows, eyes catching on something that had slipped past him before. A small chest almost, entirely hidden behind a jagged pile of fallen rocks and scrap metal. The box was old, its wooden surface scratched and weathered, but its presence now felt almost deliberate, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Mason's hand tightened on the revolver at his side. His pulse thudded in his neck, hairs on his arm standing up. He hadn't come for this, but somehow it had drawn him in. Without a word, he carefully approached, stepping lightly as though the ground itself might betray him if he made too much noise. The walls around him were silent, as if even the mine itself was holding its breath. Zane, just behind him, was too tired to speak, but Mason could feel the boy's presence, his gaze, eager yet wary, pressing against his back. He didn't want Zane to see what was coming, not yet. This was Mason's fight to win. The gold would be enough for both of them to walk away from this nightmare. But this chest? There was something more, something deeper to it, something that spoke directly to Mason's soul. His fingers brushed the cool surface of the chest, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his roughened skin. It felt solid, ancient even. Time had worn it down, but it hadn't broken. It had survived just like him, just like Zane. Mason's heart raced as he knelt beside it, the weight of the moment settling on him. He glanced over at Zane, who was looking at him with wide, questioning eyes. Mason gave him a soft nod, signaling him to stay quiet, stay back. The boy obeyed, but Mason could feel the tension in the air as they shared a look. Zane didn't understand yet, but he would. He had to. Mason took a deep breath and pried the chest open. The hinges creaked, protesting after so many years of disuse. Dust and rust flaked off the sides, spilling into the air. But Mason didn't flinch. Inside, nestled amidst a few old cloths, was a map, simple yet intricate. And the moment Mason saw it, he knew this was it, the key to everything. He ran his fingers along the edges of the parchment, its fragile surface almost delicate against his calloused fingers. The map was old, impossibly old, but it was precise. The markings, though faded with time, spoke of places, of coordinates, of hidden locations buried deep within the earth. It was a treasure map, but not just any treasure map. This one was different. This one held the promise of something far greater than gold. He held it up to the flickering light, examining it closely. There, etched into the faded lines, were symbols he recognized. Coordinates that weren't just linked to gold. They were connected to something far more valuable, something that could change the entire course of their lives. Zane stepped forward then, his voice a whisper in the air. "What is it, Pa?" Mason smiled, though it was more of a relieved exhale than a grin. The weight that had burdened him for years, the need to escape the past, the fear of failure, it all seemed to lift in that single moment. He glanced at Zane, feeling a surge of warmth and pride that pushed through the exhaustion. "It's a map, son, a map to freedom, a map to the future." Zane's eyes grew wide with disbelief. "You mean we're free?" Mason held his son's gaze for a long moment. The chest of gold, once the object of so many desperate dreams, now seemed irrelevant. It was the map that mattered. The gold could be spent, hidden, or stolen. But this map, this was their path out. This was their escape. The true treasure wasn't buried beneath the rocks. It was here, in his hands. Mason nodded, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his rugged features. "We're free, son." The sound of distant footsteps reminded them that the danger wasn't over. But for now, Mason and Zane had what they needed. The chest, the gold, the map. They weren't just walking out of this mine with riches. They were walking out with hope. They quickly gathered the scattered gold, loading it onto the wagon they had managed to bring inside earlier. Mason's muscles ached as he heaved the heavy sacks, but there was a fire inside him, now one that had reignited the moment he found the map. They were leaving this cursed place behind. The past, everything that had haunted him for years, was finally being buried in the mine where it belonged. As they prepared to leave, Mason stood for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping the mine. One last time, he thought about the years of pain, of loss, of futile searching. The ghosts of the past had lingered too long, but now they were nothing but whispers in the wind. "Let's go," Mason said, his voice steady. Zane didn't ask questions. The boy, now standing tall by his side, understood without needing to hear it twice. They were free. Finally, free. Together, father and son climbed into the wagon, the desert sun beginning to rise on the horizon ahead of them. It was a new day, a day full of promise. They'd made it. The fight, the struggle, it had led them here, and now the desert wasn't a wasteland of broken dreams. It was a place where they could rebuild, a place where a future could be forged. As they rode off, the wind howled, but this time, it was no warning. It was a song of survival. A song of victory. The greatest treasures aren't buried there, found in the moments that matter. The ghosts of the past, they were lost to the wind. But just when you think the story is over, a new twist is about to turn everything upside down. Click now to uncover the shocking truth. Hit like, comment, and follow Big Bites and Brews for more Wild West stories.